So I saw a meme the other day that said, imagine if your cell phone battery was only at 10% and it lasted 8 days. Now you understand Hanukkah. You know, that's so true in our world so often. We hear something like that and we think we know the story. But the wonderful thing about being a Unitarian Universalist is that we actually have the opportunity as both outsiders and insiders to revisit stories that we think we know. Because certainly we have folks amongst us who identify as Jewish Unitarian Universalists, whether culturally or religiously, it's part of people's identities. And so we have insiders here in our communities, but then there's people who maybe aren't so familiar with the Hanukkah story and can benefit from it. And even sometimes insiders don't know the stories as well as maybe they think they do. There's a book by Stephen Prothero called Religious Literacy, something like the subtitle is What Americans Should Know But Don't About Religion. And what he says in there is that we are a very religious country with a very high rate of religious illiteracy, even within our own traditions. People don't know much about their own traditions. I'm thinking of my Uncle Al, who every December, and I'll tell you more about them in a minute, we would go to Uncle Al and Aunt Lee's house for Hanukkah celebration. And we were Christian, they were Jewish, and our family was like that. We kind of an interfaith family. And we would go there, and I remember coming into their beautiful home and seeing all the food and everything, and finally asking Uncle Al once, what is this Hanukkah thing all about anyway? And my Uncle Al always had a twinkle in his eye. And what he told me was, after he thought for a second, he said, "They tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat." So that sort of summed it up, right? But not really. But I could see in there, he probably was thinking, how do I tell this story? And the thing is, it's a great story, but like so much of history, it's a story that is complicated to tell because there's so much context involved. So we're going to go back and just look at that story for just a minute here. So let's go back. Let's go back to ancient Israel. And what we have to know about the Jewish people at this point is that there is a temple. And this temple, I think, is hard for us in our modern day, with our modern day sensibility to understand. Because the temple is the holiest of holy places. It is so sacred. People believe that God really dwells in the temple. So you can imagine how sacred this temple is. So during this time, the Greek Empire was rising up and taking control, and people were starting to be oppressed for their Jewish faith, their beliefs. And it became a very challenging time because they were struggling with whether they could practice their beliefs, whether they could study the Torah. Lots of things were being outlawed. It was a terrible time. And on top of all of that, the temple was taken over by this Greek Empire. So in that temple, rituals were going on that were against Jewish tradition. It was a very, very hard time. So pockets of resistance started forming during this time. And in a little village, a man named Mattathias was one of these people who resisted. He was asked by these soldiers to do a ritual that was against his beliefs, and he was asked because he was someone who was respected in this village. Either he or his father, they're not sure which, was a religious leader. Mattathias refused, and not just refused, but there was killing in that moment, and he and his family fled into the hills. So when you hear about, I think in our call to worship, it talks about going into the hills. They went into the hills, and there they built a resistance movement okay? This ragtag group of people in the hills were able to come together, and over time, with Mattathias' son, they were able to go and fight this empire, and guess what? They actually were victorious, and they were able to regain this precious temple. Now, when they get into the temple, as you can imagine, it's been defiled in every way possible, and it's not been treated with respect. They have to go through this whole reconsecration process, this rededication process, which is what the word Hanukkah means, rededication. And so they do that, and as they're doing that, and this is the part of the story you know probably, there was a menorah to light, a lamp to light. There wasn't enough consecrated oil for it, just oil enough for one day, and that oil was replenished for the full 8 days that it took to rededicate that temple. So that's a story. That's a story that we know. Now, the part that's often skipped in this story is that as this Greek empire was taking over, Jewish folks were dividing into factions. Everybody was not on the same page whether they should be more culturally Jewish or not, or Greek. So you had people who wanted to stay absolutely Jewish. You had people who were starting to adopt Greek cultural ways. And so the Jewish community itself was actually divided. And what happens when communities are divided and an empire tries to take control? Right? They're vulnerable to that. They're weaker because they're not all working in unity. And the way these folks were able to regain control of the temple was by coming together in unity and working for a common purpose. So you see with this story that division makes communities vulnerable and unity can make us stronger. So it's something to think about, even in our world today. Reverend Gretchen Haley says that the miracle of this story is not so much the part about the oil, and we'll talk more about that later, but it's not so much the oil, it's the fact that they bothered to light the menorah at all. The fact that they made the choice to light it, thinking that they wouldn't be able to carry that light forward for the required 8 days. But they had a leap of faith there. They believed that somehow they would be able to keep that flame alive. And as Dave said earlier, they did. They did. Whether it was from people banding together and helping or what, we don't know. But that's the way the story goes. Now, what we do know about that story is that it was added about 600 years later. It was written down about 600 years after the rest of this story. So whether it had survived as an oral tradition or whether it was designed as a metaphor to explain this whole idea of unity and coming together and strength in being together with a common purpose, we don't know. But the point is, it was added later. I think today about this idea of lighting our lamps, and I think about what lamps we need to light in our world. This morning we certainly heard about a couple of them when we think about some of the violence that takes place. But I also think about the lights that this congregation, this congregation has been lighting over the years, whether it's for LGBTQ plus folks, whether it's for immigrants, whether it's for unhoused people. This congregation understands the value in coming together and lighting a candle to help people find their way. And finding our way and being nourished by one another, well, that's a wonderful gift. I'm reminded again of my Aunt Lee and Uncle Al. As I said, we would gather at their house for Hanukkah, for Christmas, sometime during December always. And we would walk in, the house was always immaculate. My Aunt Lee was always immaculately dressed, hair styled, jewelry flashing. These two went out dancing every Saturday night. That's the kind of couple they were. But they always welcomed us in, no matter what branch of the family we were, what religion that we were part of, who we were, whether we brought friends. Everybody was welcome at their table. We would come into their house, and there was this beautiful warm glow. The menorah would often be lit. And maybe about an hour after arriving, all of a sudden, in the kitchen, this buffet appeared. Now, this buffet had everything that you can imagine, all homemade. The potato pancakes we heard about earlier, kugel and brisket and all these casseroles that Aunt Lee was known for, and homemade braided bread. It's all just laid out in this spread in a completely immaculate kitchen with nothing in the sink. How did she do it, right? Completely immaculate. And here's the thing. Guests would start arriving throughout the evening. People we didn't expect, friends of friends, branches of the family we hadn't seen in years, and there was always enough food. A dish started to be empty, and another one came from somewhere. A miracle. Exactly. The replenishing buffet miracle. Now, when I was a kid, I just thought, well, that's expected, right? We're going to go there, and my favorite foods will be there on that buffet, and that's just the way it is. Isn't that lovely? As I got to be a young adult and I started to try my hand just a little bit at having people over and feeding them and so on, I realized how hard it was, and I thought, isn't that truly a miracle that happens? That buffet would just be there every year. What a miracle! I really appreciated it. Then as I got a little older, I realized there's no miracle there that's a magical miracle. There is something miraculous, but something miraculous in a very human way. There were people, my Aunt Lee was the number one person, making sure through labor and effort and planning and care and food waiting in the wings that buffet always was available in that way. That was the real miracle. My Aunt Lee died, I think about 5 years ago now, and Uncle Al was followed her shortly thereafter. Her obituary said she was an avid bridge player and a dedicated Rachel Maddow listener. So, our family's very mixed politically, so that was nice to see. But when she was gone, I realized that particular buffet was not there anymore, but I also heard the call, that invitation that what we do, what I do, is continue to try and offer folks that nourishment, whoever they might be, that warmth is available to them. And as I think about that light, that was my aunt, that was my uncle, and what they did in the world, I also think about the idea of darkness. And we often think of darkness as the opposite of light, but I don't think so. I think that's an easy metaphor we have relied on too long, sometimes with ramifications that have not been so great. I think that darkness can be a wonderful opportunity for us to settle down, to take a breath, to reflect, to renew and restore ourselves. I think the real opposite of lights like Hanukkah, the real opposite is despair. And I think when we despair, that's when we start just turning inward. We stop inviting people to that buffet. We stop lighting our own light, and then people stop feeling encouraged to light theirs. You know, we are in a season, as we said earlier, that is so joyful in so many ways and also can be so challenging to hold. But I hope that we continue to lean on each other during this time, help one another light our candles. And I think if we look around, we will see that there are candles in the world that are already lit for us. Can you see compassion and care in the faces and actions of others? That's one candle in the dark. Can you see people acting with care in the midst of violence and conflict? That's two candles in the dark. Do you see places where people are resisting power that overreaches? That's three candles in the dark. Do you see people trying, however awkwardly sometimes, to make connections across differences? That's four candles in the dark. Do you see the resilience of people who are so often targeted and oppressed and wounded, but still resilient? That's five candles in the dark. Do you see the beauty of this earth all around us, this gray, drizzly morning that also offers us a way of sustaining life, of allowing seeds to grow and blossom into new things? That's six candles in the dark. And you stand and look up at the night sky, the canopy of stars, the planets, and know that there is this vast, mysterious, wonderful universe that is greater than any one of us can fathom in our brains. That's seven candles in the dark. And finally, can you be visionary enough to know that so much possibility is available to us? That together we have more intelligence, more resources, more imagination than we can even fathom. That is 8 candles in the dark. But let's not forget that final candle, the one we learned about with the kids today, the helper candle, the one that helps light all the other candles. It's a reminder that candles, no matter how bright their glow, don't just light themselves. Happy Hanukkah.